This is the story of the Sherman tank from a different angle. We're going to spare you from over-repeated information and myths, and instead show you the whole picture of its role in World War II. Once and for all, was this a good tank that helped win the war, or nothing but a death trap for its crew? Let's begin. Before World War II, the United States thought that tanks wouldn't play a major role on the battlefield. They were quickly proven wrong by the Germans, who used them to great effect in their blitzkrieg tactics, shocking the world with their rapid advance. When it became clear that the United States would enter the war, the best, let's say, tank they could send to the front lines was the M1 combat car and the M2 light tank, both of which were severely outdated compared to what the Germans had. To make matters worse, the United States had only ever built 300 tanks up to that point, with no large-scale production facilities, experience, or even proper equipment for tank manufacturing. So they scrambled and came up with an often overlooked stopgap solution, the M3 Lee tank. They had already outdated 37mm gun with a turret, as well as a 75mm field gun, but they still lacked the technology to mount that 75mm gun in a rotating turret. So they did the best they could to field something in North Africa, where the Allies were sustaining heavy tank losses against the Germans. The 75mm gun was modified and crammed into the hull in a fixed casemate. On top of that, they slapped on the already familiar 37mm gun and its turret, packed 6 people inside and sent them off to battle. It needed to plug the gap and buy time until something better could be developed. US engineers working on the Sherman were closely observing European tanks, trying to learn from their advantages and shortcomings. They needed to come up with a new tank as soon as possible, and it had to be agile, well-armed, well-armored, reliable, and most importantly, cheap and quick to produce in huge numbers. It also had to be light and compact enough to be lifted by cranes and loaded onto ships. So through various ideas, errors, and trials, the M4 Sherman was born. They had what they thought ticked all these boxes, and it was ready for deployment in October 1942, just before the Battle of El Alamein. Around 300 Shermans were delivered to the British 8th Army, which urgently needed tanks to replace its horrific losses and support its remaining tanks already outgunned by the Panzer III and IV. And so, the Sherman saw combat for the first time in the hands of the British. Alongside other tanks, they were immediately thrust into heavy assaults against Rommel's Afrika Korps, and although they were not invincible, the Sherman was a huge improvement over the Crusaders and M3 Lees. It had greater firepower and better armor protection, and even came with an early version of a stabilization system, allowing it to fire on the move with some accuracy. But the most important thing was its reliability in the harsh desert terrain, where other tanks struggled to work. The Sherman was far more reliable and easier to repair and put back into action. The Americans applied their automotive industry experience, ensuring that all parts were standardized and available in great supply, which was extremely important in the field. The Sherman's 75mm gun was much better than the 50mm gun on the Panzer III and the short-barreled 75mm on the Panzer IV. It also had solid protection against them, at least until the Panzer IV was upgraded with a high-velocity 75mm long-barreled gun. However, losses were high from the start as combat was extremely intense. The biggest tank killers were actually mines, and 88mm anti-aircraft guns repurposed as long-range tank killers, which were a nightmare for the Sherman's high silhouette and medium-range gun in the open desert terrain. There were a few encounters with Tiger ones which first appeared in Tunisia, and they didn't end well for any Allied tanks. The stories of Tiger encounters terrified Allied tank crews so much that they often mistook Panzer IVs for Tigers in battle. So, all in all, the Sherman was deemed good enough and pushed into mass production. And when we say mass production, we mean that at the height of production, one Sherman rolled off the assembly line every 30 minutes, with over 50,000 units produced throughout the war. However, on the battlefield, some glaring flaws quickly became obvious. The Sherman couldn't effectively destroy a Panzer IV or anything heavier unless it was at point-blank range or had a clear side shot. And then there was the second, more infamous issue, its tendency to burst into flames when hit. This earned the Sherman some controversial and morbid nicknames that stuck with it to this day: Tommy Cooker, Ronson-Leiter, etc. Let's first address the gun issue. You've all heard about the Sherman being a medium tank with a medium-velocity gun. The Sherman was designed to support infantry and fire mostly high-explosive shells, which were quite effective, while towed anti-tank guns were originally the primary means of destroying enemy armor before tank destroyers were introduced. Also, the Sherman's gun was deliberately shortened so it wouldn't exceed the length of the tank's hull, making transportation on ships and trains easier. So the Sherman was never really intended to be a tank killer. Of course, in practice and combat, you couldn't always choose your fights, and it quickly became clear that the gun needed an upgrade. The British came up with a stopgap solution, much like the Americans did with the M3 Lee, by cramming a 17-pounder gun into the Sherman's turret, creating the Sherman Firefly. Later, the Americans developed the 76mm gun and a new turret for versions like the Easy-8, somewhat leveling the playing field in terms of armor penetration. Nevertheless, the Sherman compensated for its lack of high-velocity projectiles with the sheer volume of ordnance it could put downrange. It could fire up to 20 rounds per minute with a good loader. Even enemy tanks were sometimes engaged with high explosive or smoke shells to blind them and destroy their optics, and a couple of Shermans firing together at the same target was nothing to laugh at when you were on the receiving end. Now, the most famous issue, the Sherman being a death trap. While it was far less protected than German tanks, the Sherman actually had the highest survivability rate for its crew, with an average of 1.3 tankers killed per destroyed tank. For comparison, T-34 crews had twice this number, despite the tank having one fewer crew member, meaning that 50% of the crew was killed per knocked-out tank. The biggest problem wasn't its gasoline engine catching fire after the first hit, as was often portrayed, but actually the ammunition storage. In early versions, shells for the main gun were stored in the hull sides, also known as sponsons, in unarmored containers. This was the most likely place to get hit in the tank, and on top of that, the shells were completely exposed to sparks and shrapnel that would fly through the tank if penetrated. This earned the Sherman its grim nicknames. Statistically, 7 out of 10 times a Sherman would immediately burst into flames after being hit. To solve this, the ammo rack was moved to the floor and wet stowage was introduced. This area was less likely to get hit, and if it was hit, the ammo bins were surrounded by a container filled with a water glycol mixture. If perforated, this fluid would extinguish the fire or at least buy enough time for the crew to bail out. This dramatically reduced the Sherman's tendency to burst into flames from around 70% down to below 20%, greatly improving crew survivability. But once the Sherman entered the war in Europe, it was vulnerable to almost every anti-tank weapon the Germans had, and if it ran into anything heavier than a Panzer IV, it was usually a bad day for a couple of Shermans. You've seen the countless photos of additional armor plates, sandbags, logs, track links, and even concrete added to Sherman armor in a desperate attempt to increase protection. Commanders were furious at first and ordered tank crews to remove this improvised armor, but it continued to be used throughout the war. Crew survivability was further improved by adding a hatch for the loader. Yes, the loader didn't have his own hatch and had to go through the commander's hatch, then around or under the gun breech. One veteran Sherman loader recalled his horrifying experience from the war when his tank was hit in the upper right part of the turret. The shell instantly killed the gunner and commander, trapping the loader inside as the tank quickly filled with smoke. He couldn't move the two bodies in the tight space of the turret, but luckily for him, the turret was traversed in a position that allowed him to crawl under the gun to the driver's position where the driver had already bailed out, and from there escape through the driver's hatch. This was resolved by simply adding a hatch for the loader, along with springs for easier and faster opening in an emergency. The driver and co-driver also received wider hatches when the frontal armor plate was sloped 10 degrees less. The Sherman's armor was softer than armor of German tanks, and while this made it easier to penetrate, it had an unexpected benefit because it created less shrapnel when hit. German armor was much harder, at least before shortages of manganese made the steel too brittle. When German tanks were penetrated, the armor broke apart violently, sending sharp steel fragments flying inside the tank and shredding the crew, and in Sherman this effect was significantly less. The Sherman was chosen as the backbone of the Allied armored forces and saw combat in all theaters, used by different nations and converted into numerous variants. In the European theater, they struggled against heavy German tanks, which executed some devastating ambushes. But in reality, tank-on-tank battles were rare. They were widely talked about because when they did happen, they were dramatic and unforgettable. In one of the first encounters between Shermans and new German armor in Europe, 17 out of 18 Shermans were knocked out in just 20 minutes. However, the majority of knocked-out tanks weren't total losses and could be repaired and put back into action. The mechanics, however, were often traumatized by what they found inside penetrated Shermans if a crew member had been hit. The scenes were often so gruesome that the entire interior had to be repainted over the stains of what was once a tanker. The swimming duplex drive Shermans led the way in the invasion of Normandy, while many others were modified for roles ranging from laying bridges to clearing mines and everything in between. Shermans arrived when and where they were needed, and most importantly, always in large numbers. It wasn't a perfect tank, and the US had already started looking for a replacement during World War II to correct the Sherman's flaws. But bringing a new tank to the same mass production level as the Sherman during wartime was impossible, so the Sherman remained the main workhorse until the end of the war. It made up for its flaws through sheer numbers, ease of production, and reliability, playing a major role in bringing World War II to an end and forever staying in our history.